Hello, hello. Ooh, that's loud. I'm Amy Mitchell from the Center for News Technology and Innovation, and I look forward to talking with you today about safeguarding diverse, independent news media in policy. We are at a point in our society today where we are debating and passing more laws that relate to journalism both directly and indirectly than we ever have. This is occurring at the same time that it is harder than ever to put borders around what journalism is and what it is not. And that is from the perspective both of the business and legal kind of laws and policy space, as well as what the public considers journalism and the things and sources that they rely on to keep them informed on a daily basis. We are also seeing a growing array of issues in the policy space that relate to journalism. Everything from content moderation to protection of the internet to disinformation to artificial intelligence. Again, times that are directly related and other times where it's indirectly related. And in this space of the digital landscape, policies that are passed in one country very much tend to impact and be impacted by policies that are passed in another country. And so it's very important to be thinking about these things across country and regional borders. And we are seeing all of this happen amid a time when we are facing growing government encroachment on information control and on press freedoms. And this comes through both in data we gather from journalists themselves. What you see in front of you is an international survey of journalists that CNTI conducted with a number of partnership organizations like GFMD, Global Fund for Media Development, Online News Association, and several others around the world. And you see here that 50% of the journalists that we surveyed, this was in the fall of last year, had experienced some form of government censorship ranging from not being allowed to cover or access an event to complaints about their content to imprisonment. 50% had experienced at least one form of that in the last year. We're also seeing the World Press Freedom scores across the board go down from the entities that are tracking this data year in and year out, so much so that we are down to 1993 levels of world press freedoms. And this is occurring both when we look at the government censorship as well as the independent protection of journalists in this space. We're also hear it in the conversations that we have. One of the things CNTI does is host convenings, which are really day-long working sessions with a combination of folks from journalism, technology, policy space, research, civil society to talk about these issues. And this is one that we held in Mexico City with OEM, was our co-sponsor there. And this conversation specifically focused on how to continue to produce journalism amid ongoing security threats both on and offline. And a lot of the discussion that came up from those in the rooms had to do with not only feelings of safety and other kinds of online abuse, but also in terms of the ways that policy had been used, policy that was technically, in theory, aimed at protection of information or if journalists was being actually used to imprison or otherwise control journalists and the information space. And so if we look across the policy space amid this landscape today, what we find in the data is that even the best intended policy, that which is really looking to safeguard our information space, to create vibrant digital landscapes, can end up having unintended consequences on the independence of our press and on journalism viability more broadly. So then the question becomes, how can policy address the issue areas of concern, of which we're talking about here this week, while safeguarding an independent, diverse media and the public's access to a plurality of fact-based news? And that's where CNTI comes in. The Center for News Technology and Innovation is a global research center. We've been around not quite 2 years, a little over a year and a half now, but we are an organization that focuses on enabling independent, sustainable news media, maintain an open internet, and foster more informed public policy discussions. And we do this by conducting research as well as synthesizing research from others. My background is research. I come from 25 years at the Pew Research Center. I helped launch the journalism line of research there, directed that for many years. Have now decided to move into this space. We also help synthesize research. As a research community, I think we do a pretty lousy job sometimes of helping make sense of what our research all adds up to, where there are gaps, and where we need to do more. We then host convenings, like I was talking about, to try to really work through some of the challenging questions in these spaces and come up with informed solutions. So back to the question, how can policy address issue area concerns while safeguarding an independent, diverse news media and a vibrant digital landscape? So here we go to some of the research that CNTI has done over the last year that I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes. But what we do is range from policy analysis to issue primers to surveys. We did the journalist survey. We've done a 4-country public survey as well that both was a mix of focus groups as well as fully representative statistical surveys, convenings around the world, and more. And what I put forward today is a set of questions that we have found to be critical questions to explore in any digital policy that is being debated and thought about today. Again, both those that directly relate to journalism, but also very much so that where the journalism and a vibrant digital landscape are likely to be impacted, even if not directly related in the policy. I'm going to spend more time on each of these, so I'm going to run through them very quickly right now. But the first question is, what's the definition of language? We started with a lot of our work just saying, how is journalism being defined here? How about a journalist? How about news? The other areas that are being talked about in this policy. What's the definition of language and how consistent or inconsistent might that be across policy in ways that matter? The independence of journalism. A big question to be spending a lot of time on is who is given that oversight authority to determine the details of how a law gets practiced and enacted. Diversity. One of the things that the internet brought was a diverse landscape of information in a way that served minority communities, allowed new kinds of voices into this space. So how do we work to build a vibrant digital landscape in a way that still safeguards that diversity of voice, especially in the news and information space? Serving the public. We talk about doing all of this to serve the public. How are we actually serving the public in these policies, especially in the behaviors and the ways that they access and get information today? Technological relevance, being forward-thinking, cross-border impacts, and also unintended consequences that may or may not be clearly evident on the surface. And these questions to explore all take time and deep thought and collaborative discussion. So the first study I'm going to share a little bit about is one that we did that looked at fake news policies around the world. And we put the fake news in quotes. Many of these actually use the language of addressing fake news. We looked at 32 policies that were proposed or enacted between 2020 and 2023 that cut across 31 countries. And so I'll say straight out that there are more of these that were in autocracies, but 11 of the countries included here are democracies, and so the findings that really resonate across different government types in terms of some of the takeaways that can happen. And overall, the overall conclusion was that overall these policies created greater risk to journalistic independence and diversity, as well as the public's access to a diversity of fact-based news, than they did to actually safeguard the information space. Getting back to definitions, one of the first things we looked at here was how is fake news or illegal content defined, and how might news or journalism or what might be considered real news be defined. And you can see here that only 7 of the 32 actually put a definition around what fake or illegal content was, and the remaining left that vague, which leaves it up to the authority figure, right, the one who gets to make the decision about the enactment of that policy, to put those definitions in place. Same thing on the news and journalism. Only 2 actually spoke to what real news or journalism might be. And this is very much a double-edged sword. We talked a lot about this with some of the folks at UNESCO. Guy Berger was an advisor on this project who's done a lot of work with UN and information integrity. And one of the things that we talk about in this report is the degree to which, well, defining these things in policy can help safeguard journalism and an independent press. It can also be language that gets used against journalism and an independent press. So it's very important both to really consider the definitional language, but also to then get to the next question, which is, okay, who's the authority figure? Who's the one that then gets to determine what that language means? That's what we looked at next in this study. And you can see 14 of the 32 policies very specifically put the control of the authority there in the hands of the government itself. And most of those were talked about the central government being the ones that was in control. There were others that gave the authority to some sort of body within the government where it was often unclear how closely associated that other body was to the central government figure or not. And the remaining left it unclear as to who had authority to arbitrate that law or that policy, which then naturally puts it back in the hands of the government. The next question then becomes, okay, what's the punishment if you get put into determined that you were a part of this fake news? And the bulk of these policies did have some sort of imprisonment. And it ranged from less than 1 month in Lesotho, I think, up to over 3 years in Zimbabwe. And so there was real government action that can be taken against journalists by the uses by the language in these policies. And so before I move on to the next study, if we just broaden this out to a question about content moderation policy more broadly, one of the things that's really important to ask in that space of policy, disinformation, content moderation, et cetera, is what is the end goal for the way the content is going to look? And I'm not sure one of the things that we're spending more time in the coming year looking at is that very question. It's not clear within the policy conversation space that we've really actually done a very good job at all of articulating what would the digital landscape look like if this content moderation policy that we're talking about gets put in. What is it that's bad that's out? What is it that's good that's in? What's the mix? There's always going to be a mix of content in there. So really taking the time to think about the ultimate goals there. The second study that I'll share a little bit about was very specifically, this is an example of one that specifically looked at, was very directly related to journalism in the media space. So these were media remuneration policies, which are basically revenue policies looking to be a revenue stream to add some revenue, financial lifeblood into the journalism industry, which many of you know has been having a hard time lately with its financial structures and support. And this looked at 23 policies that were considered or passed from 2018 through August of 2024. And there's a pretty wide mix. I will say it does include also a number of state policies in the U.S. because the state policy space in the U.S. is very active these days. So there are quite a number in this that are included. The first thing we did here was start a framework. And this is something else that we really recommend when you're in a complex policy space with a wider range of the kind of focus or orientation of these policies, is to say, okay, what's the actual financial structure or the subject orientation of how this is going to work? And you can see here that the first 3 are really around actually usage criteria, digital interaction that then says that warrants some sort of compensation. The second set is subsidies that are either coming directly from tech platforms or in some cases from the government itself. And then the third is a tax mechanism, which is either creating or building off of new taxes. And once you get this framework in place for whatever your subject area, your policy is, you can, any new policy that comes in, you figure out where does it fit into the framework that we've created. So then we broke the analysis into two parts, again, with these core questions that I showed you all earlier in the top of our minds. And the first was definitional in the sense that it was, how is the usage and interaction of digital content determined? And then when that definitional boundary is put on, if so, to what degree, what amount of content should be paid for that content? How does that decision get made? When is it appropriate to charge for digital usage? Is compensation for digital usage applied consistently? Who benefits then? Who gets that money? Where does that money actually go? And then the second half of the analysis looks at the questions of these core viability or sustainability elements to journalism. How do we keep an independent news media? How do we support diversity in this space? How do we sustain journalism that is actually serving the way the public gets informed today? And so I'm going to walk through this really quickly because this is a lightning talk. But there's a lot more detail on the website if you want to go into any more of it. And I'd be happy to talk with anybody about it in greater detail as well. So first on the digital usage side, what this really shows is just when you look at what the criteria of usage was or is articulated across these policies, it varies dramatically. And so the two green circles are actually at the sort of what's at the ends of the spectrum in terms of what usage could be in terms of content, and then you see here inside that it ranges from things like clicking on a UL link to having a title of the article to actually, it's usage of content for indexing, or it's creating an article summary and having that summary. That warrants content. And so the definition of what usage and interaction actually means varies dramatically across these policies. And so too does what the level of compensation would be, as well as who that compensation would be going to. In some cases, it's going to the organizational level. In some cases, it's going to individual journalists. Usually, it's actually at the organizational level. There's been more in the recent months that has been shifted to going to journalists or journalism producers themselves. So we see a great variety there, which brings us back to the importance of really articulating from the get-go what the goal is and how do we use the best language to clearly articulate and in a consistent way what we mean here. And then the second half of the study, as I mentioned, looks at these journalistic viability elements. First independence, then diversity, public interest, and access. And when we talk about independence, as we saw in the fake news study, anytime you're creating policy, you give the government a role, which isn't a bad thing, right? That's what policy's for. But it does mean it's really important to think about what are the safety mechanisms in place to be sure that in this case, particularly in the journalism and news space, that it doesn't end up giving an individual government or figure, as the years progress, the ability to take control over the information space. And one of the things we saw in these policies was that in many cases, even if it was left unclear as to who had that authority to arbitrate the law, and if there were third party or third agencies, kind of how that got determined and how it would get determined over time. Diversity, again, the biggest thing we saw was that it was a really inconsistent and kind of haphazard approach to the diversity of news media that would be in there. When it's, a lot of these that began really ended up oriented more around your very large news operations and outlets, and some, as we got further into the policy timeline, called out ethnic, certain minority kinds of media or ethnic news outlets. There was only those that really focused on the tax extension element that focused on local journalism itself. And so how do we be sure that policies in this arena are going to support that diversity of voices in the journalism space that has been so valuable to the public? And then finally, public interest. And I will say on the innovation side, only the EU directive and one state law, state policy, New Jersey, in the States actually spoke at all about being forward-looking and the innovation side of technology and where that might lead us in the future. On the public interest side, all of the talk is about serving the public. And there were references to the public in there. But what was unclear was how these steps actually do a better job of getting the news and information to the public, especially thinking about the ways that the public is getting information, the diversity of producers of journalism that the public is turning to, including oftentimes many smaller individual journalism producers that the public has come to trust and rely on. The third policy area, which we are just in the early stages of now, so I'm just going to give you sort of a touch of the framework that we're using, is in the AI policy space. And here, there's so much policy being talked about, being enacted. Many are not actually can be enforced legally at this point. But very, very few in this space talk about journalism or really the news information space directly at all. But if we know about what's happening with AI and where the digital landscape more broadly, there very much is indirect and in the end direct relationship with the way AI policy can and likely would affect the digital news landscape. So thinking about those things inside these other policies is really important before they get passed and too far down the line. How can it affect journalists' ability to make use of the benefits of technology while also safeguarding against the risks? And then how do these policies work across state and national and country lines? So this is the framework in general, and I'm not going to go through this in detail because I want to have time for questions. But one, if we, again, we're starting with, okay, what's the range of the kind of policies that are out there? And you can see here, there are many that create a committee or an agency. Okay, do those committee or agencies have somebody from the journalism sector to play a role, to be a part of that? Do they take information integrity into account? Those that focus on deep fakes, synthetic content. This is one where we look at, okay, what's the impact on journalists and their reporting? There's a lot of good that can be had by having some sort of policies in place around deep fakes, but how does that resonate with the way journalists, some of what the journalists need to do, especially in unsafe areas, to be able to get their information out there? What labels, how do labeling these kind of things have public relevance? If you think about watermarks, C2PA was up here last week. There's a lot of good in that kind of identity inside content, especially that's AI driven. But what does it mean to the public? We've done a lot of research and actually have started a research working group that's global on this topic specifically to try to help make sense of what the research says about the public response to labeling, to not labeling, and how are there ways that journalists and others can make use of labels while actually fostering public trust with technology and with their work. As opposed to further diminishing it. There's the focus on algorithmic bias and discrimination. And one of the things that's important in this area of policy, I'll just mention as an example, is that in that and the frontier model, there's a lot of liability that goes on the user. And so that can be the public, it can be companies, it can also be the journalist that's using it. And so it's very important to think about who that user space may be, and are there ways that the policy would want to define that and make sure that that is very clear in terms of who can be liable for content if there's some sort of negative usage effect that comes out of it. And then comprehensive regulation. So again, we're just in the beginning stages of this analysis, and I will look forward to sharing it when the team is done. And I'm just going to close with a couple more pieces of data that get to kind of the public side of all this, because ultimately this is about safeguarding an independent press, and a diverse news media is about serving the public in the digital information space. And so it's really important as we all delve deep into policy deliberation and making decisions that we don't forget about the public that we're serving. So, and how does the public think about journalism, about the ways that they can get informed today? That has been greatly expanded inside the digital landscape today. And you can see here from this data, these are the 4 countries that we did this survey in, that there's great value that the public places on journalism and the role that it plays in society. And that really cut across the board. But we also see in the data that the public has a very broad definition of who can be producers of journalism today. And it may be somebody inside an organization, it may be an individual who's working on their own or doing their own work. And what came through in the follow-up focus group discussions that we had is that it's mission-driven, it's guided by principles, it's all of those elements that we think about of journalism, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a news operation. So when we think about policy, and for putting implications of policy into space, how does all that work when we're thinking about producers of journalism today? And then finally, we can see that people are going to individuals that they consider journalists for their content today. And this is the final one, which is to also remember as we're doing these policies that both the journalists, the journalism producers, and the public see technology as critically important in their ability to produce the news, to gather it, to disseminate it, and also to get informed. So again, coming back to these policy questions of how do we then do the best job of enabling the benefits and the needs in this space while also guarding against the potential harms. Quick wrap up of the questions that we suggest you keep in mind. These are for journalism policy specifically, but they really carry through in a little bit of a nuanced way for all digital policy. And all in all, what's most important is that in this critical policy space, that policymakers, technology companies, media companies, journalism producers, researchers, civil societies actually work together to have really thorough conversations that are driven by data, a seeking of knowledge, that keep the public interest in mind to be able to keep up with changing technology and determine how best to mitigate the risks while enabling the benefits. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions. You can sign up for our newsletter here, follow us, different places, the website here. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jan Altgeld. I've got two questions. First one relating to your, well, both actually relating to your sample choices of your first study. When you, that I think 31 countries you had covered. I was a little surprised that you, in the European Union, you took in 4 individual member states rather than the EU as a whole, because I think most of the aspects covered are now by the DSA, are covered by the Digital Services Act. So these laws, the national laws, have mostly become obsolete. And the second question is, to put it directly, what is the point of having really established autocracies among the sample where it's obvious and clear that they will use any excuse to control the informational sphere and to use laws against disinformation to control, to exercise control. So what's the point of having that? That is just, to me, obvious. And what conclusions can we draw from that?
Yeah, those are 2 great questions. Thank you. On the EU, and I can share more on the methodology off stage, but the the EU Online Safety Act is the one that was in place. And that was actually broader and didn't talk directly about fake news. It talked about online safety. And so what we looked at instead were specific country policies that related directly to fake news or illegal content online as opposed to broader online safety. We have a whole footnote in there in our methodology on that specific decision, but it's a good question. And really it's also about examples. So the CNTI, Center for News Technology Information, does not advocate or call out for a specific policy. And what this is doing is saying, what's the range of what's out there, and how can we learn from it when we look at that, as opposed to commenting very specifically on one particular policy or another. But there is a whole methodology that does go into the detail on that decision and the timing of when we had the cutoff for those selections. On the autocracies, good question. One, they're countries. They have people that live in them that get affected by the laws. We should care. That's number one. Number two is, as I was mentioning earlier, there are so many policies that carry impact from one country to the next, whether it's copycatting, and we saw that there was a policy that was very done in a very well-intended, proactive way inside a democratic country that got then pulled by India to use for information control. So it's also important to think about the ways that policy can be taken by another entity and used for ill service when it comes to the information landscape. But it's also something, especially if we're here at the UN and IGF talking about collaboration and how do we really have supportive environments, to be aware of what's happening in other countries. Other countries? Do we have time for one more? Last one.
Hello, thank you so much. That was super interesting. I specifically appreciate that you brought in that we should look more at like the public perspective of this and like serving and the people we're actually trying to serve. And so I was wondering, because these policy on especially disinformation, they get so tricky with the definitions as you mentioned. I was wondering if you would recommend that actually countries should also put more emphasis on the demand side of disinformation. So like, why do people maybe believe disinformation? Why do people engage with disinformation? Why is it so easy for them to look at that? And I know that, for example, in Sweden, there's this psychological defense agency by the government that kind of tries to prepare the population a little better to engage with how to engage with disinformation, how to like recognize it. And I was just wondering if that would be like a different approach to sort of look at that more in terms of policy.
It's certainly an important, thank you for the question, it's certainly an important element of it, right, is what is the public doing with all this content. There's actually a fair amount of research, and there's a lot that actually shows like the disinformation campaigns don't have a whole lot of impact on what people actually believe or don't believe, but that people's own behavior and where they're choosing to go can have that. One of the biggest things that we see, though, and this was some research I did back in the days that I was at Pew, is that what the public would categorize as disinformation can vary greatly, right? And so we have clear evidence to see that the way that the public would say, well, that's disinformation, and our data show, at least in this one study we did, that there are very much alignments to one's political thinking, to the kinds of sources you turn to. That's a broader societal question too, right? So I think your question comes back to the content moderation slide that I showed, which is articulating what's the goal of the policy and what's the goal of the information landscape. I mean, it's not going to be perfect. We've never had a perfect information landscape. So what is the goal? And then what are the best mechanisms to put in place that do the best job of reaching that as close as we can get without other unneeded risks and harms that can be brought into place. It's a really tricky balancing act. It's an area that CNTI plans to spend more time examining in the coming year. Thank you all. My time is up. Thank you.